Gentlemen, we have a problem.
When the air route across the Atlantic was blocked,
What are we going to do with all these big boats if we have no ocean to cross?
he saw another option.
Here's what we'll do. We'll fly from California to China,
Across the Pacific.
right across the middle.
But Vaughn,
No airline had ever taken such a risk.
There was a huge number of people that thought this was just an absolute folly.
We can make this work.
Good afternoon, everyone, from the rim of the Pacific Ocean. The occasion of this broadcast is the inauguration of the first trans-Pacific airmail service by Pan American Airways China Clipper.
The departure of the China Clipper was probably the most hyped, most anticipated, most publicized event of that era.
In a sense, it was akin to the rocket launches of the 60s.
The China Clipper in front of us weighs...
Everybody was tuned to their radios. Everybody that could was out there looking.
Part of the mystique of this event, I think, was the implied danger of the journey itself.
There's 2,400 miles that you've got to go, and there is nothing but water.
You're aiming at a tiny speck of land in the middle of a vast trackless ocean.
It was a great adventure that could possibly end disastrously. Nobody knew yet.
Behind the adventure were hundreds of men and women, from the famous to the unknown. Like the NASA engineers and astronauts who would later put a man on the moon, these earlier aviation pioneers were trying to achieve the impossible in less than a decade.
Bill, it's a go.
They had begun in 1927 with a single 90-mile airmail route. Now, just 8 years later, they stood at the water's edge, poised to vault a vast and dangerous ocean.
China Clipper, are you ready?
Almost as soon as airplanes were capable of flying, pilots began flying them over water. Could you make it across? That was the test of pilot and plane. Frenchman Louis Blériot flew the 21 miles of the English Channel in 1909. His countryman Roland Garros crossed the Mediterranean in 1913. And World War I was no sooner over than the press turned its attention to the next aviation milestone, the U.S. Navy's attempt to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. Among those following the attempt was 20-year-old Juan Trippe, fresh out of the Naval Air Corps and now back in school at Yale. Even with a string of ships to guide them over the long leg to the Azores, 2 of the 3 Navy seaplanes came down at sea. The third took 11 days to reach Lisbon. Yet Trippe remained sanguine. The successful crossing, he wrote in a college magazine, showed that a flight across the ocean is a perfectly safe and sane commercial proposition. He would spend the next 16 years pursuing that goal.
The funny thing about Trippe, it wasn't about making money. It was really about conquering the world.
Trippe would go on to become one of the most influential airline executives of the 20th century, the head of Pan American World Airways.
Juan Trippe was Pan-American, imperious, aloof, arrogant, and visionary.
Trippe's achievement, it's enormous. Aviation is the way it is today because of him.
But Trippe did not do it alone. Among his key collaborators were Charles Lindbergh, whose solo flight across the Atlantic electrified the world. Igor Sikorsky, a brilliant airplane designer who had fled Russia after the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, and an unheralded young engineer named Hugo Leuteritz, who thought radio might have a role to play in aviation. 4 men, each with his own dream. But when they joined forces, they would help transform the nascent aviation industry.
Trippe looked at aviation in the 1920s and said, yeah, it looks like this now. But he never wavered in his belief that with the help of people like Lindbergh, Sikorsky, and Leuteritz, he could grab it and mold it and reshape it into something fundamentally different.
Trippe had a vision, but he also had a tenacity to go with his vision. He had this great assurance that he could make this happen.
On a rainy morning in May 1927, hundreds of aviation enthusiasts gathered at a Long Island airfield to watch a little-known pilot named Charles Lindbergh take off on his attempt to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. Lindbergh was the latest contestant for a $25,000 prize for the first non-stop flight between New York and Paris. 6 men had already died in the attempt, but the aviators kept coming.
Most of the groups competing for the Orteig Prize were doing it with multi-engine aircraft, large ground crews, enormous amounts of equipment.
Others had at least 2, but usually 3, even 4 people aboard to relieve them when you get tired at the controls, because the flight would be a matter of a day and a half. And the safe thinking said that you need more than 1 person to do that. Lindbergh rejected that way of thinking. He was flying a single-engine aircraft, and he was also flying alone.
He was dubbed the Flying Fool. Everybody thought that he was going to take off from Long Island, vanish into the fog, and never be heard from again. And, of course, he proved them all wrong.
After 33.5 hours in the air, Lindbergh arrived over Paris in darkness, with Le Bourget Field lit up below.
He finally lands to tumultuous applause, and there's just surge of humanity.
Paris went collectively nuts for Lindbergh, and the rest of the world quickly followed suit.
When Lindbergh arrived back in New York, not only was there a huge crowd waiting for him at the dock, but the harbor itself was teeming with ships.
He was given a ticker tape parade that apparently exceeded anything before or since in New York City.
A crowd estimated at 4 million people turned out to greet him,
which was greater than the population of Manhattan. Just amazing.
But amidst the hoopla, Lindbergh took time out to meet with an unemployed airline executive named Juan Trippe, whom he'd met during his days as an airmail pilot.
Trippe goes to meet with Lindbergh, and it manages to talk to him for a few minutes, probably as pilot to pilot.
Hello, Charles. Congratulations on the flight. It's a great day for aviation.
And Lindbergh complains that everybody's all over him. He doesn't know what to do.
May I make a suggestion? Of course.
He actually counsels Lindbergh, don't do anything until you've thought through all the possibilities. Don't even negotiate with me.
And Trippe advises him to get a lawyer, because Trippe had a proposition for him.
Trippe's first airline had gone bust. He'd been fired from his second. But a week later, when they met again, the 28-year-old businessman calmly laid out his plans for the new airline he was about to form.
We think that that's the next step towards an airline that can span the world.
The world?
Trippe was a big young man, slightly heavy but tall, and he carried himself and behaved like a much older man.
It would be an international airline, flying first to the Caribbean, then to South America, and finally across the oceans.
But Juan, I just crossed the Atlantic. For a plane carrying mail and passengers, it's thousands of miles between stops. How do you intend to do that?
By the time we're ready to take on the oceans, there'll be a whole new generation of planes.
Dad had this aura of confidence. He would present his argument, let it sink in, and then be quiet.
What would Mr. Lindbergh's role be in this new airline?
Trippe is offering Lindbergh at this point a contract and $10,000 a year to be paid by an airline that doesn't even exist yet. But he's a pilot. He wants to explore the world as a pilot, and Trippe is offering him the world.
Sounds intriguing.
I think what Lindbergh sees in Trippe is a kindred spirit. They're both passionate about the possibility of aviation.
He was looking at him and saying, here, come with me. Let's build this together.
By the end of the meeting, Lindbergh had agreed to work as a technical advisor to the new airline.
Send us your proposal.
It was a huge coup for Trippe, one that would pay many dividends as he pursued his lifelong ambition. Trippe had been hooked on aviation since the age of 10, when his father, a New York investment banker, took him to see a demonstration flight by Wilbur Wright.
Wilbur took off in Manhattan, flew south along the Hudson River, and then around the Statue of Liberty and back. And literally, hundreds of thousands of people lined the shoreline.
The flight around the Statue of Liberty was a huge event in terms of the number of people who, for the first time, saw someone fly.
It would surely have captured Juan Trippe's 10-year-old imagination.
And it stayed with him for the rest of his life.
Are you declaring an emergency, sir?
Watch all episodes of Ice Pilots. Watch on mobile devices or the big screen. All for free. No subscription required. Download Veely now.
Trippe still had flight on his mind when he arrived at Yale in the fall of 1917, just months after America had entered World War I.
A lot of his classmates, particularly the upperclassmen, were already very interested in aviation, and a lot of these young boys went off to Europe and flew for the Allies.
Trippe followed their lead, quitting Yale to train as a Navy pilot. But the war ended just as he was about to ship out. Back at school, he was active in the Yale Flying Club, played football, and rode crew.
He was very proud of being an oarsman, being a football player, and through both of those sports, he met a great number of people, and they became lifelong friends and important to him in life.
People like the Vanderbilts, the Whitneys, the Rockefellers, the big names in American finance, the guys that had made the huge fortunes.
They became great friends and actually supported Juan Trippe throughout his career. They got caught up in the sense of passion of what the airline industry could become.
After graduation, Trippe went to work on Wall Street.
He sold bonds, which didn't excite him. In fact, it drove him nuts.
He called them the dullest years of his life.
Finally walked out the door determined that for better or worse, he would make his future in aviation.
Trippe had no idea what a struggle it would be. World War I and the demands of aerial combat had led to bigger, faster, and more durable planes. But it wasn't clear what they'd be good for in peacetime.
A lot of these airplanes are simply sold off to the public. They're bought up by people who go off barnstorming, taking people on thrill rides.
Others used their war surplus planes to provide entertainment at air shows.
After World War I, aviation quickly developed a reputation as a kind of carnival sideshow. You paid money to sit in bleachers and get your tonsils sunburned by staring up at these daredevils who were performing these acrobatics. And frankly, one of the reasons why people went was they wanted to see people risk their necks. And sometimes they were not disappointed.
The United States government was also pioneering airmail during this period. The incredibly dangerous job of flying the mail across mountains, through storms, through snow and sleet, and yes, even gloom of night.
I remember being there at the start of the first night airmail flight in 1925. The plane was a Frail, temperamental wartime DH-4, in whose box-like nose a Liberty engine clattered away, carried a hatful of mail and a few hours' gas. The lone pilot had no blind flying instruments and few safety aids except for his parachutes. Ahead of him were no marked airways, no chained airports, no radio beams to guide him, and his weather service was a head cocked aloft in a prayer.
Of the first 40 pilots hired by the mail service, something like 3/4 of them were dead within 8 years. So people definitely associated the airplane with death by the 1920s.
Aviation's exciting, it's thrilling, but it does not make you want to get in an airplane yourself.
It really wasn't a serious proposition in terms of transportation.
Yet a few people, including young Juan Trippe, had an unshakable faith in the future of flight.
Trippe saw beyond the hullabaloo and the spectacle of aviation. Somehow he sensed there was a great commercial future to this, the transport of passengers.
Leaving Wall Street behind, Trippe formed a company called Long Island Airways.
And this is the first time he goes to the well with his wealthy friends from Yale.
Trippe bought 7 war surplus seaplanes for $3,500 and began offering New York socialites rides to their summer homes in the Hamptons and down to Atlantic City.
Interestingly, when he started that service, he hired other people to be the pilots.
Pilots was somebody you hired like chauffeurs, and he wanted to be seen as something different.
So almost from the beginning, Trippe saw that his role would be on the business side of aviation.
In May 1925, Trippe met the younger sister of one of his fraternity brothers, a 20-year-old brunette named Elizabeth Stettinius. Invited to spend the weekend at the Stettinius home on Long Island, Trippe brought his golf clubs.
Dad was an avid golfer, a very good golfer. My mother was a pretty good golfer herself. And they got to the 3rd hole, so the story goes, and Dad hit first and hit a nice long drive, as he always did. And my mother came up to her tees, and she just whacked one. And he just turned and said, wow, she hits a hell of a ball.
Juan and Betty would see a lot of each other over the next few years. But Betty's father, a partner at J.P. Morgan and Company, would not give his blessing to the match until Trippe abandoned his crazy flying schemes and found a real career.
Aviation was for reckless young men who liked to walk on wings and barnstorm and crash airplanes. And here Trippe was trying to put on a business basis something that wasn't a business.
The Stettinius family were convinced that he was a nice guy. If he would go into a reasonable occupation, undoubtedly he would be very successful, but they saw this young man as being close to a lunatic in terms of trying to earn a respectable living.
Trippe's prospects for marriage and career dimmed further when Long Island Airways went out of business after 2 summers. His was a common experience in the 1920s.
Commercial aviation in the United States was a struggle. There wasn't much of a market, and passengers were few and far between.
These little airlines were starting up all over the place and going bankrupt almost as fast as they started.
There was no stable way to make a living in the air in the 1920s until the government begins to delegate mail contracts to the airlines.
The turnaround in aviation's fortunes came when Congress passed the Airmail Act of 1925.
A lot of people don't realize that in the early days, the entire airline industry, it was built by the post office.
Instead of operating its own planes to deliver the mail, the post office would turn over the job to commercial carriers, awarding contracts for specific routes.
And that suddenly made it a money-making business.
What this did for the airlines was to give them a reliable source of income.
And this was just what Trippe was looking for. So he goes back to some of his wealthy friends from Yale and asks them to back him in another enterprise to secure the airmail contract from Boston to New York.
Facing formidable competition from a group headed by Governor John Trumbull of Connecticut, Trippe engineered a merger into a company called Colonial Air Transport. Colonial won the New York-Boston route and named Trippe its managing director, a decision the board would soon regret. Instead of delivering the mail in single-engine planes, as its government contract required, Trippe ordered much larger tri-motor planes, made by Dutch designer Tony Fokker.
So he's figuring, if I can get a bigger plane, I can accommodate passengers and I can accommodate the mail.
Trippe was already thinking of international travel, particularly to Latin America.
He went on a junket to Cuba in a Fokker trimotor piloted by Fokker himself.
Before they even delivered the first airmail packages, he's already all the way down to Cuba thinking about the possibilities of this future airline.
Is that who you want running your business?
When the company struggled to make money on the short New York-Boston route, Trippe got into a dispute with the board over how much to bid for a longer route to Chicago. When the question was put to a stockholder vote, he lost.
So he was out.
If they gave him back his investment and told him to take his Fokker trimotors with him.
This setback only reinforced the Stettinius family's misgivings about the young man pursuing Elizabeth.
They saw Trippe as somebody who had only failures behind him. He was 26 years old and obviously going nowhere. And they shipped her off to Europe, which is what you did with young girls at that time if you wanted to break up a romance. So here he's out of a job, no future, and no girlfriend.
My dearest Bets, I can't tell you how much I miss you, or how lost I feel with you on the ocean going farther and farther away from me every minute. I miss you more and more each day, with a sort of dull pain that takes all the joy out of life.
The letters show a very human side to both of them, and also this deep affection between the two of them.
My dearest Juan, how will I ever bear being away from you for even a week, to say nothing of the months I'll be abroad? I just couldn't stand it if I didn't realize you're going to miss me too.
If it wasn't for the picture I have of you on a little table beside my bed, I'd be absolutely sunk.
Betty's departure only increased Trippe's resolve to make a success in aviation.
He was discouraged often, but he was never discouraged to the point that he gave up hope in the future of aviation.
Then came the event that changed everything.
Up in the sky.
After his triumphant return to New York, Lindbergh embarked on an aerial tour of the country. The American people poured out their adoration in poems, paintings, knickknacks, songs, even a popular dance step renamed the Lindy Hop.
The scope of this Lindbergh mania was just extraordinary.
It also signaled a new day for aviation.
Lindbergh's flight in 1927 is that moment for aviation, when it goes from being daredevil stuff to being, this is serious, this is the future. For all that they'd called him the flying fool, he was an incredibly sober, careful person.
Lindbergh's successful flight had been due not to luck, but to his obsessive pursuit of a unique strategy.
Lindbergh's plan was to maximize fuel and minimize all other weight. There's even a story about him trimming out the unnecessary parts of the map that he was taking with him.
He made being a pilot boring, which is terrible if you're trying to stage an air show, but it's essential if you're running an airline and trying to convince people to put their lives in your hands.
People started to think, well, if Lindbergh can cross the Atlantic on one engine, then maybe it's safe for me to fly a shorter distance over land in a multiple engine plane.
Lindbergh's flight across the Atlantic catalyzed what became known as the Lindbergh boom.
Not just wealthy people, but even small individuals wanted to own an aviation stock. So it looked like there was a real business there to invest in.
Sensing his opportunity, Trippe, a two-time failure as a domestic airline executive, formed a new company and turned his attention to the international airmail routes the post office would soon begin awarding. His first target was a 90-mile route from Key West, Florida to Havana, Cuba. But two other companies had their eyes on the same prize. Major Henry Hap Arnold of the Army Air Service had founded a company called Pan American Airways, now being run by former military officer John Montgomery and his partner Richard Bevier. Also in the running was noted aviation financier Richard Hoyt, a partner in the Wall Street investment firm Hayden Stone. Trippe joined forces with Hoyt and set out to engineer a merger with PanAm.
Well, we like the position we're in. General Arnold's stature gives us the inside track on the route.
But the post office isn't going to award this route to anyone unless we consolidate.
That's not what we're hearing.
Gentlemen, why don't you come take a spin on my yacht? You can hear it from Glover himself.
Under pressure from Assistant Postmaster Irving Glover, the three groups agreed to work out a merger, and the post office awarded the Key West Havana airmail contract to PanAm. But service must begin 3 months later, on October 19th. As the merger negotiations dragged on that summer, Trippe sent updates to Betty in Paris.
The letters expressed this frustration about what was going on in the founding of the company, all the arguments that are going on, the ups and downs.
When I wrote you last Thursday, everything looked rosy. This morning, the deal is off.
Don't be discouraged, dear. I know you'll beat the game. I just feel it in my bones.
At one point in September or October, Hayden Stone pulled out totally, and the whole financing fell apart.
Darling, I don't want this to come between us. Perhaps it might be better to acquire a little more experience in a business with a more assured future.
He was writing to her saying, I'm going to go do something else. Maybe I have to go back to Wall Street.
What do you mean starting again? Do you mean in some field other than aviation?
He said on a couple of occasions, I can't make it go. And she would come back and say, you can't quit. You're going to make it work. I have such confidence in you.
Instead of quitting, Trippe redoubled his efforts.
Dear Dick.
Trippe was a fantastic negotiator. Even at the age of 28, he just kept on and on and on with whatever he had that you didn't have.
One thing you should consider is no airline can deliver mail to Cuba without landing rights. Something that
What he had in this case was a trump card: exclusive landing rights in Cuba, secured from President Gerardo Machado during that junket that so angered his bosses at Colonial.
How would you see this merger working?
This will take some time to sort out, but there will be roles for all of us.
When the three groups finally agreed to the terms of the merger, the company named Juan Trippe its president and general manager.
If you looked at the key players for this first foreign airmail contract, you've got Richard Hoyt, who is quite experienced and quite wealthy. You've got Hap Arnold, and then his successor, John Montgomery. And then you've got 28-year-old Juan Trippe. But he ends up outmaneuvering the two of them to ultimately become the head of PanAm.
But with the October 19th deadline looming, there was no time to celebrate.
This merger actually comes together on October 13th, 1927. They've got 6 days now to consummate this particular airmail contract.
That date of October 19th sat out there as a major problem.
If he doesn't make that flight, he's got nothing.
He had his Fokker trimotors in place, but the runway in Key West was flooded.
He's got men down there trying to tamp down the Key West airport, which it turns out is practically a swamp, is full of holes.
And every time they would grade it and make it almost serviceable, the rains would come and wash it away again, and the clock is ticking away.
In desperation, Trippe had an idea.
Operator, get me Key West.
A seaplane could land off Key West and in the harbor at Havana.
So now he has people scouring every city for miles around, begging for some pilot to come down to Key West and carry the mail to Havana.
And finally, at the last moment, appeared this angel in disguise with a Fairchild float plane.
For $200, the pilot was persuaded to add a stop to his planned route.
They fling the mail bags on board, and he takes off, and an hour later lands in Havana and unloads the mail and keeps going. That's the shortest footnote in aviation history. His name is Cy Caldwell. That's the one mention of him you'll ever see. Hello and goodbye, Cy Caldwell. But he saved Pan Am.
9 days later, a Fokker trimotor began regular airmail service to Havana, where it was christened the General Machado, after the Cuban president.
Dad sent this wonderful telegram to my mother.
Business completely settled. Departing Florida Saturday. Returning 2 weeks to meet your boat.
And when she saw the words, first flight's successful, she broke down into tears. It was just happiness and joy.
Sailing Mauritania, November 19th. Counting the hours. Love, Bets.
Even with the Havana service underway, Trippe realized he had a problem. Land planes like Fokker trimotors would encounter more swampy runways as he worked his way south. Seeking a more adaptable plane, he reached out to a Russian aircraft designer now working on Long Island. His name was Igor Sikorsky. In Russia, Sikorsky had been an aviation legend, building 4-engine bombers for the Russian army in World War I. But after the Russian Revolution of 1917, Sikorsky's close ties to the military made him a target of the Bolsheviks.
He was now an enemy of the people.
Warned he was on a list of people to be executed, Sikorsky fled.
He actually escaped with his life and only with his life.
He was advised by friends, get away, come back when all this settles down. So he gathered up his plans and set his sights on America.
But when he arrived in New York, Sikorsky discovered that America's glut of cheap war surplus planes left little demand for new aircraft. For 4 years, he supported himself by teaching math and astronomy in New York's tight-knit Russian immigrant community.
Eventually, this group of Russian immigrants convinced him to get back into the aviation field. Nearly 30 workers, many of them out of a job anyways, threw their lot in with him.
Sikorsky set up shop on a Long Island chicken farm and began building a large passenger plane. The chicken coop served as the machine shop, but with no hangar, the plane had to be built outside, weather permitting.
The band of supporters all lived on the chicken farm, kind of in a communal fashion, and worked together as a team to build this transport.
Funds were so short that discarded hospital bed frames, scrounged from the local dump, were built into the fuselage of Sikorsky's first American plane.
As I look back at that time, I sometimes wonder that we had the courage to go on with such makeshift parts. But in fact, the airplane was very strong.
Even so, Sikorsky found no buyers. There was simply no market for large passenger planes.
Nikolai,
By 1927, Sikorsky had designed 9 American airplanes, all of them technically sound, but had few orders to show for it. His little company was struggling to survive. Worse, his effort to win the Orteig Prize had ended tragically when his S-35 was unable to get airborne with its heavy load of fuel. Rene Fonck and his co-pilot were able to scramble free, but seconds later the plane burst into flames, trapping the other 2 crew members in the inferno.
Sikorsky, of course, was devastated by this, the loss of life most especially, and his inability to make sure that the aircraft was robust and ready for the flight.
I can only imagine the anguish that he would go through. It would be easy to think that now would be a good time to give it up. It's just not going to happen.
But the excitement caused by Lindbergh's triumphant flight had given Sikorsky new hope.
A rapid development in aviation appeared to be around the corner, so we determined to make one more effort to create a new plane.
Sikorsky knew that many parts of the world, like Key West, still had no suitable runways.
However, New York City, Boston, Havana, Chicago, LA, all these major cities are all on big waterways. So he has an idea that that is really where commercial aviation is going to get its foothold. He started experimenting with amphibious aircraft. These are aircraft that can land on water and also have the capability of dropping wheels and landing on land.
The fruit of Sikorsky's experiments was a plane called the S-38.
This is a bizarre-looking airplane. It has a parasol wing that is attached to the rest of the aircraft only by struts and wires. It has a fuselage slung below that.
And that started with a boat hull, the bottom of a boat with a long snout in the front.
Between the two, attached to the struts, are two engines, and the tail surfaces are way back behind the aircraft, added on what looks like an afterthought with these tail booms.
One critic called it a collection of airplane parts flying in formation.
It's kind of an ugly duckling.
But it worked. It was able to carry 8 passengers. And even though it was ugly in many people's minds, it served the purpose.
This was an airplane that could land almost anywhere, in rivers and swamps and open sea. Turned out to be a superb airplane, and versions of it are still flying today.
Somehow, my grandfather knew he was onto something, and he didn't build one. He built 10. Before the 10 came off the line, there was an order for 10 more. The S-38 became the first real American success, and in fact, his most successful aircraft in his designing career.
More than 100 S-38s would ultimately be built at Sikorsky's new Long Island factory, sold to explorers, corporate executives, and airlines around the world. The S-38 finally put Sikorsky's company on a firm financial footing, and it was the foundation of a long relationship with Juan Trippe, who would buy nearly 40 of the planes for PanAm.
It was a particularly useful airplane for Latin America, where you had bodies of water to cross, you had ports to land in, you had inland destinations where there were no airfields, only a little dirt runway, and the S-38 was suitable for all that.
So it was a perfect plane for the time.
While Sikorsky was developing his new plane, PanAm was discovering the challenges of operating an airline in the tropics without a communication system of its own.
When a plane took off in Key West, they would send a telegram to Havana saying the plane was on its way. Invariably, the telegram would get to Havana after the plane landed.
These problems didn't sit well with PanAm's chief engineer, Andre Priester.
Priester was a little gnome-like man, a bald-headed Dutchman who had immigrated to the United States in the early 20s.
And he spoke imperfect English, and the pilots were always mocking the way he spoke. But the man had a vision of what aviation should be, could be.
And he demanded perfection. He'd fire people on the spot for being slovenly or disrespectful or being out of uniform.
Priester was a nut about safety. He was a nut about cleanliness. He was a nut about so many small things which made PanAm what it was.
Realizing the young airline would need a communication system to meet his high standards,
Juan, we need radio down here right now.
Priester summoned the engineer who'd been trying to interest PanAm in radio.
Yes, get that Leuteritz fellow from the RCA.
For 3 years, Hugo Leuteritz had been trying to sell aviation executives on another emerging technology, radio.
The first transatlantic radio message was 1901, the first flight 1903. These were two technologies starting out together. Nobody had any idea where or if they would go.
Young men at the turn of the 20th century loved playing with radio. They would make their own radio sets, and it was just magical. They could hear something out of the air.
I was an amateur radio man by the age of 13. I got one of these cardboard Quaker Oats oatmeal containers and wrapped wire around it to make a coil. That was my first radio set.
He was as in love with radio as Trippe and the others were with airplanes and aviation.
In 1919, Leuteritz was hired by the brand new Radio Corporation of America. With broadcasting still a few years off, RCA put him to work doing basic research into the mysterious properties of radio waves. Then, in 1925, RCA asked Leuteritz to investigate a potential new market.
They said, look into this aviation thing. It might be interesting from a business point of view. So what I had to do was to go out and get the feel of the thing.
Leuteritz took to riding in the airmail planes, many of them biplanes still, left over from World War I. He'd sit on top of the mailbags, and he realized very early on that the pilots were constantly lost.
Whenever they ran into lousy weather, they didn't know where the hell they were. So they would come down and fly along a railroad track until they could read the sign on the station.
That was navigation at the time. And he saw that radio could help them. They'd be in contact with their base, wherever that was, and then maybe there was some way to navigate via radio.
For nearly a decade, ships had been using radios as beacons to find their way.
But the radio sets of the day were enormous. No airplane existed that could lift them off the ground.
I asked RCA for $25,000 to develop some lightweight radios for use on airplanes. RCA turned that down. They said aviation was not ready for spending that kind of money.
So Leuteritz built his own prototypes and offered them to the airlines. But he found no takers. Until the phone call from PanAm. Leuteritz arrived in Key West in July 1928. RCA had given him 2 months to test his belief that radio had a role to play in aviation.
It was the only nibble he had got so far. And he began to put his theories and his researches and his contraptions into practice.
Flying between Key West and Havana, he searched for the radio frequencies that would best cut through the static of the tropics.
I couldn't do the flying and the ground measurements at the same time, so I relied on the crew to do the air work. All the flight mechanic had to do was hold down the telegraph key at certain times. But I couldn't depend on the man in the air because he had other things to do, and to him, this radio business was secondary.
So Leuteritz sent for radio engineer Ferris Sullinger from New York. Aboard the plane, one of them would press the telegraph key, while the other would listen on the ground to identify the frequencies that came through best.
After 3 or 4 flights across there, I said to Priester one night, Andre, you've been in aviation longer than I have, but it seems to me that something has to be done about navigation.
What do you mean?
The pilots think they're flying in a straight line, but they're not. Depending on wind conditions, we've made landfalls as far east as Matanzas. In other cases, we've wound up 60 or 70 miles down the coast west of Havana.
Leuteritz had put his finger on one of the challenges PanAm would face as it ventured out from the security of the American shore.
When you're flying over land, you actually can see features on the ground, and in fact, over land, we tend to navigate by flying, particularly at the time, from feature to feature. When you're flying over water, often the water looks the same, so you don't really have a good way of knowing exactly where you are.
In 1928, pilots would use a compass to point their planes in the right direction.
But if there was a wind, a crosswind, what would happen is the airplane would drift off the course.
Cuba was a big enough target that the pilots could easily compensate.
The pilots would hit Cuba, have to figure out where they were and go either left or right along the coast to find Havana.
But on the return trip, Leuteritz realized the tiny target of Key West made the margin for error much smaller.
And he said to Priester, we have to come up with a method to communicate with our airplanes and help them get to wherever they want to go. And I think I can do that.
We're going to need a direction finder.
Early radio manufacturers often sold their sets with antennas in the shape of a loop, just as a way to save space. But engineers quickly discovered that the orientation of a loop had a profound effect on how well it picks up an incoming radio wave.
If I rotate it so the wave is coming right at the edge of the loop, I'll get the maximum signal.
Turn the loop 90 degrees, and the radio signal falls off to nothing.
So by rotating the loop and listening to the strength of the signal, I can figure out what direction the wave is coming from. You can use that as a way to navigate.
With Sullinger's help, Leuteritz set out to apply these principles to flight, using a loop antenna to take bearings on a radio signal from a plane, and thereby determine the plane's location.
All right, listen up, guys.
Leuteritz next tried to sell PanAm's pilots on the benefits of radio.
I began flying with the airmail pilots 3 years ago, and I could tell immediately that radio could be helpful to help figure out where the hell you're going. I've designed a set of lightweight receivers and transmitters.
But they were cool to the newfangled technology.
And Sullinger and I would love it if you fellows would help try them out.
None more so than Robert Fatt.
I've thrown better pieces of radio equipment off my planes than you can build.
There was nothing really like this in aviation at the time, so when he tried to communicate that there was another way to navigate, it was actually hard for the pilots to relate to.
A few weeks later, Fatt took off in the General Machado on a late afternoon flight from Havana to Key West.
And my father was on board as the radio operator. The pilots in those days, they would go up to approximately 10,000 feet. And because it was only 90 miles in distance, they could see Sand Key light, normally.
Visibility had been good when they left Havana, but 20 minutes into the flight, they ran into a thick haze. Fatt dropped to a lower altitude in search of clearer air, to no avail.
Visibility poor. No sign of Key West yet. Stand by.
Look up that side for Sand Key light.
An hour into the flight, they still hadn't spotted Key West.
I used the radio transmitter to give the people on the ground a running account of everything we were doing. Things running smoothly.
Have not sighted anything yet.
Andre, something's wrong. They should be here by now.
That's holding them up.
Low visibility. I can't see anything.
The receiver that had been in the aircraft was on the ground in Key West for repairs. He couldn't receive, but he could send. So the people in Key West were very aware that the plane was in trouble.
You see anything out there?
It normally took an hour and 15 minutes to fly back, but after an hour and 45 minutes, Fatt still saw nothing.
Based on the winds measured at takeoff, the pilot decided he must be east of the Florida Keys, so he headed northwest, expecting to find them.
Fatt turning northwest in search of Keys.
Using Leuteritz's loop antenna, Sullinger could tell that Fatt had turned in the wrong direction and was now headed out over the Gulf of Mexico.
It turns out that the wind had actually blown them to the west, so when he turned to the west, they just got further away from land.
He's heading over the Gulf.
Can't we warn him?
We can't, because the receiver is right here. It was acting up yesterday, and so we brought it back for repairs. We have no way of communicating with him.
As Fatt continued scanning the horizon for any sign of land, Priester and the others continued to monitor the plane's radio transmissions in Key West. Afternoon turned to evening as the flight reached 2 hours, 2.5, 3 hours.
Gas running low.
3.5.
We're going in. Hugo, we're gonna make a water landing. Prepare the passengers.
Okay.
Spotted tanker. Attempting to make water landing alongside. Stand by for further updates.
The next thing I know, the lights went out.
They're down. They're in the water.
Leuteritz himself was not cold, and when he comes to, he's inside the cabin, which is filling up with water.
So I managed to get a lungful of air and pull myself forward. And I felt something slide underneath me, so I pulled it along too. It turned out to be one of the passengers.
Four of the 5 men aboard were rescued by a nearby tanker. But the second passenger drowned, and Leuteritz was hospitalized with a fractured pelvis.
Juan, I have bad news.
The plane was lost, and news stories describing the crash dealt another blow to the public's confidence in aviation.
It's a huge black eye for PanAm, because here's an airplane that on only a 90-mile trip wound up 300 miles off course.
After the crash of the General Machado, even Trippe's confidence was shaken. If a plane could crash 300 miles off course on a journey of 90 miles, how could he ever cross the oceans?
When you start thinking about going across the ocean, you're talking about going thousands of miles. You were never going to be able to do that unless you had a precise way to navigate.
This accident, more than anything else, convinced Trippe that he needed to solve the problem of navigation. And to solve that problem, he needed Hugo Leuteritz.
After sending Trippe a report on his findings,
It's very impressive.
He would be an asset.
Andre?
Leuteritz got an urgent call from Andre Priester. Trippe wanted to see him.
How's the hip?
Still a bit gimpy, but much better. Thank you. Should be fully mended in about a month or so. I'll have a martini too as well, thanks.
Andre told me what happened in Key West. I want you to join Pan American to head up communications.
Juan, you only have a few airplanes and one airmail route. It's not enough to keep me busy.
We'll have a whole fleet of planes soon enough. Next year, we'll be flying to South America. And after that, we'll cross the Atlantic and then the Pacific.
Trippe offered him a full-time job, and his reaction was, I know what I can do. I don't know what you can do. Maybe I'd be better off staying with RCA.
My father was not really convinced yet that long-distance aviation had a future.
Andre will have nobody else but you.
Well, I'd have to talk it over with Alice. And I'd have to give some notice.
That'd be fine.
A few days later, Leuteritz secured a leave of absence from RCA to join PanAm.
And at that point, Trippe's dream of conquering the world became possible.
In Lindbergh, he had a world-famous aviator who could pioneer PanAm's new routes, lending enormous credibility to the young airline. In Sikorski, he had a partner who could build the kinds of planes he would need. In Leuteritz, he had the man who could develop the technology to guide those planes safely to their destinations. And by securing the Key West-Havana route, he had taken the first step toward conquering a continent.
To learn more about the people, stories, and technologies behind Across the Pacific, please visit our website at www.acrossthepacific.net.